Hey everyone, and welcome to this podcast, continuing to go through Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Discipleship, exploring how the ideas that Bonhoeffer has in Papers and Letters, which we've explored a little bit already by going through Metaxas' book, Religionless Christianity, and showing how these things are present already here at the beginning of Bonhoeffer, and how Bonhoeffer's thought, there's a continuous line that kind of moves through this, even as his thinking develops. Now, one of the things that I'm toying with or wrestling with, and I'm not quite sure how to go about it, is this recognition that Christianity is being hijacked by ideas that just are not Christian, and advocating for a certain form of Christianity that I think is, in the end, harmful. And it's harmful in the sense that it takes us away from the message of the gospel, which is about the transformation of this world. And it's harmful because it takes us away from our humanity. And I would argue that when you explore the history of Christianity and belief, you will find within that history an orthodox version of Christianity. Yeah, it looks different in different times and places, but it weaves its way through until we get in here to kind of contemporary versions of American Christianity that have, in many ways, have gone off the rails. I think what I want to do is continue to use Bonhoeffer, and hopefully as we move through Bonhoeffer, we can use his theology as a way to have these little sidebar conversations about what Christianity and the message of Christianity really is for the world. Now, one of the things that he talks about at the very beginning of discipleship is the difference between cheap grace and costly grace. So with cheap grace, there's a sense that it doesn't ask anything of us. He refers to that as grace as presupposition. When we start with the idea of grace, well, then we don't really have to change, and everything that we do is covered by grace. So it doesn't expect anything. It doesn't demand anything, and it doesn't force us to take responsibility for our lives. Whereas costly grace is a conclusion. And he uses Luther as a way to describe this. And so I want to pick up where I left off in the last video on discipleship and explore this idea, because I really feel like this is important as we begin to wrestle with what Bonhoeffer means when he's talking about grace. So here's what he writes. He says, the expansion of Christianity and the increasing secularization of the church caused the awareness of costly grace to be gradually lost. The world was Christianized. Grace became common property of all the Christian world, and it could be had cheaply. But the Roman Church did keep a remnant of that original awareness. It was decisive that monasticism did not separate from the church, and that the church had the good sense to tolerate monasticism. Here on the boundary of the church was the place where the awareness of that grace is costly, and that grace includes discipleship, was preserved. People left everything they had for the sake of Christ and tried to follow Jesus' strict commandments through daily exercise. Monastic life thus became a living protest against the secularization of Christianity and against the cheapening of grace. So what he's saying is that as Christianity began to grow, as society and culture became Christianized, the sense of grace as being costly disappeared, and there was a cheapening of grace. Grace was something to be had. You lived your life. You lived within the broader culture. You lived within the ideologies of the particular culture. And what he means by the secularization of Christianity is when you think about what the gospel opposes. So as we think about the violence and the political violence and the honor-shame culture in which this was found, and the emphasis upon honor, the power struggles that endured, the emphasis on accumulating and gaining wealth, all of these things became a part of the church. And what's interesting is, on the one hand, Christianity desacralized the world. In other words, the pagan religions emphasized so much kind of the natural orders and so on. And when Christianity comes in, there's a desacralization that takes place. And there's a way of thinking about that as secularization in a positive way. But what's left are the forms of ideology that remain. Political power, violence. In our own day, we would have to talk about the ideological power of capitalism and how economics shapes us in so many different ways. And so what Bonhoeffer is saying here is that as the world became Christianized, what ended up happening was the church became secularized. And what he means by that is all of these ideologies became a part of the life of the church, but they were done under the umbrella of grace. This is what he means when he says grace as a presupposition. If we start with, God has done it all for us, God has saved us in Jesus Christ, we are free from sin, now we go out into the world, what need is there to not live like the world, to not follow these cultural ideologies, these political ideologies? And I would say something similar is happening today, where the church is becoming secularized, meaning the cultural ideologies that are present out in the world are now at work in the Christian community. What's fascinating about this is that so many conservatives think that this is all happening on the left, whether it's LGBTQ, sexuality, whatever, but it's not. It's happening on the right. There's a sense in which capitalism, political power, political struggle, violence, all of these things are being blessed by the Christian community here, at least in the United States. And there's a cheapening of grace. There's a cheapening of the understanding of what Christian faith is about. Because for Bonhoeffer, and what he would say is for Luther, this is grace without discipleship. This is a declaration that we are freed by the work of God in Jesus Christ, and therefore we're not saved by what we do, and so we don't need discipleship. We don't need to work out our faith with fear and trembling. We don't need to try to figure out what it means to live in this world. We don't have to confront the ideologies of our world. In fact, when you try to have conversations with people about ideology, they're happy to have them about all of this cultural stuff that's going on the left. But many people can't recognize how it's happening on the right. They think that their version of Christianity is just Christianity and can't recognize all the cultural things that have been wrapped up within them and how that cultural ideology is at work. This is what Bonhoeffer is really trying to get us to see. And what is he saying about monasticism? Well, the church allowed for monasticism to exist because it became the remnant of costly grace. Okay, so no longer were people being persecuted for being Christians in the early church. How could they demonstrate their faith? Well, they're going to demonstrate their faith by giving away everything and going out into the desert and fighting these spiritual battles. And when you read about desert monasticism, it's absolutely fascinating what St. Anthony and others are doing. Now, what's interesting is in some circles, when you try to bring up desert monasticism and what's actually what's happening there, what's happening with St. Benedict, Bonhoeffer is not saying that these things are wrong. But in certain circles today, you bring up monasticism in the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and you will get an earful from Protestant Christians who really are harping on this idea of works righteousness and so on and so forth. And what they can't see, and this is what Bonhoeffer wants us to see, is through the secularization of the church, we've given up on a costly grace that calls us into a life of discipleship and discernment and responsibility. And we have now entered the world of cheap grace, where we are Christian and therefore it's almost a blessing to everything that we do, or every form of life that we have. Bonhoeffer says this about monasticism in that same paragraph. He says, "But the decisive mistake of monasticism was not that it followed the grace-laden path of strict discipleship, even with all of monasticism's misunderstandings of the contents of the will of Jesus." So in other words, he's saying, well, what was wrong with monasticism was not them going out and giving away, trying to live a life of poverty, even though he would say, at least he's saying, that may not be what Jesus is intending for everybody. But for Bonhoeffer, that's a symbol and sign of costly grace. They're taking the words of Jesus at least seriously. He's saying rather the mistake was that the monasticism essentially distanced itself from what is Christian by permitting its way to become extraordinary achievement of a few, thereby claiming a special meritoriousness for itself. In other words, you create a class of people who are living the life of costly grace, and the rest are just living cheap grace, and yet can look at them and say, "Oh well, look, we've got Saint Anthony, or we've got Saint. Thank God they're out there living the Christian life on my behalf." And this is the problem for Bonhoeffer, and this is why he's going to talk about the awakening that Luther has as a monk. He says this. During the Reformation, God reawakened the gospel of pure, costly grace through God's servant, Martin Luther, by leading him through the monastery. Luther was a monk. He had left everything and wanted to follow Christ in complete obedience. He renounced the world and turned to Christian works. He learned obedience to Christ and his church because he knew that only those who are obedient can believe. Luther invested his whole life in his call to the monastery. It was God who caused Luther to fail on that path. God showed him through Scripture that discipleship is not the meritorious achievement of individuals, but a divine commandment to all Christians. The humble work of discipleship had become in monasticism the meritorious work of the holy ones. Self-denial of the disciple is revealed here as the final spiritual self-affirmation of the especially pious. This meant that the world had broken into the middle of monastic life and was at work again in a most dangerous way. Luther saw the monk's escape from the world as really a subtle love for the world. In this shattering of his last possibility to achieve a pious life, grace seized Luther. In the collapse of the monastic world, he saw God's saving hand reaching out in Christ. He seized it in the faith that our deeds are in vain even in the best life. It was a costly grace which gave itself to him. It shattered his whole existence. Once again, he had to leave his nets and follow. The first time when he entered the monastery, he left everything behind except himself, his pious self. This time, even that was taken from him. He followed not by his own merit, but by God's grace. He was not told, "Yes, you have sinned, but now all that is forgiven. Continue on where you were and comfort yourself with forgiveness." Luther had to leave the monastery and re-enter the world, not because the world itself was good and holy, but because even the monastery was nothing else but the world. So here we see Bonhoeffer recognizing that grace, costly grace for Luther, is a conclusion, not a presupposition. And this idea of leaving the nets, like he's called out of his life, he leaves it all behind, and he thinks that this is what he's got to do, and he's deconstructed from his worldly life into the monastic life, but then ends up creating a life of piety that now also needed to be deconstructed. And so he leaves his nets again, and he comes back out. But it is this sense that discipleship is always movement. That we can never think that we have arrived. And the problem that Bonhoeffer sees is that for many Christians, they think they've arrived right away. And we'll see this with Kierkegaard down the road. But faith becomes the starting point, and somehow we are going to get beyond faith. And here for Bonhoeffer, grace is the starting point. And now we can get beyond grace. No. The life of discipleship is the working out of our faith, to walk the road to Mount Moriah as Abraham did, to walk the road to Calvary, to take up our cross and to follow Jesus. So again, it's the same with grace. Grace is, or costly grace, is the conclusion to all of this. It's the recognition that try as he may, everything that he did was captured within this inward turn of sin. That try as we might to create a perfect society on earth in a monastic world, we still get caught up in the ideological issues at work and need to be constantly deconstructed. This is what Bonhoeffer recognizes and sees. And now, what does this have to do with us? I mean, what's interesting is there's so much happening in the Christian community today where they want to Christianize everything. I've been trying to think about, like, what does it mean for us to live in the world? What does it mean for us to embrace secularity? Now, what do I mean by secularity? For me, my understanding of the secular is to try to free the world from these ideological, or what Bonhoeffer would call it later on as the religious intonations, and free the world to be the world. And yet when the church today wants to Christianize everything and make grace and faith the presupposition of engaging in all of these different things, is falling into the same trap that Bonhoeffer saw with the secularization of the church. When we Christianize everything and we don't challenge, this is the key, we don't challenge the ideological stuff at work. We never challenge or ask questions about capitalism. In fact, in many circles in Christianity, you can't ask those questions. You get accused of being a Marxist and then you're canceled. And yet capitalism as an economic system in the ideological form that it takes shapes us and forms us in ways we don't even recognize. And we bring that back into the church. That is the secularization of Christianity in the way Bonhoeffer is using the term. It means we're going out into the world and we're Christianizing it all, and we're slapping Bible verses and prayers and everything else on things without actually asking about the ideological question. What are the forces at work that are shaping who we are? And that, in the same way, then, we're living into cheap grace. Cheap grace and the Christianization of everything becomes justification for us to be in the world and do whatever we want. To play by the same rules, function the same way, and it never calls us back out into this question that costly grace wants of, what does it mean to be a human being made in the image of God? What does it mean to follow Jesus? The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is a deconstruction. It is a tearing down. It is ripping us down. All of our human attempts that we do to create a world, to create a religion, create God, are torn down. And in the resurrection, we are knit back together. We are recreated as the new humanity of Jesus. So again, this is what Bonhoeffer is doing. And I think it speaks so well today with what's happening with the church. And the problem with Metaxas and his view of Bonhoeffer and his view of Luther and so on is he gets caught up in this works righteousness stuff and doesn't recognize the ideological issues here that are at work. And also I think we can fall into that trap of making grace the presupposition and think that once we've got grace, now we can do whatever we want. And yet costly grace is a call to discipleship. It's called to live intentionally in the world, to struggle in the world, knowing sometimes there are just two bad choices that we must make, but to take responsibility for our life in this world as Christians. This is what costly grace is for Dietrich Bonhoeffer.